All right, welcome everyone. So like we discussed in class on Wednesday and outlined in the syllabus for Writing 1010 class composition on Friday, September 8th, we're going to meet asynchronously. All right, so the goal today is going to be talking about effective narrative titles. Now, granted, we're a little early in the game to start discussing titles, but there's no reason that we can't really start brainstorming ideas about strong titles. When it comes to creating a narrative title, the idea is not unlike a lead sentence in that your goal is to grab your reader's attention and compel them to read on. And a good, strong, effective narrative title does just that. So I have a PowerPoint we'll look at and we'll talk a little bit about narrative titles. Like I mentioned, a good narrative title manages to get your reader interested in your essay, in your story, and then compel them to read on. And like you see is the title of this PowerPoint right here in front of you, hooking them from the start, mastering the art of titles. That title you're looking at is actually a specific type of title. It's called a two-part title, where you use a first part that's sort of attention grabbing and interesting, a colon, and then a second part that's really specific. That's a very common way of writing a title for an academic essay. So we're going to talk firstly about just titles in general for research essays or academic essays, and then we'll shift our attention to personal narrative titles, which have sort of a different way of going about composing them. So we tend to think of titles as like an afterthought, and it's not uncommon that the recommendation is you wait until after your essay is written to come up with a title. I've always felt differently about that. I think coming up with a title early in the process is a good idea because it gives you sort of a goalpost that you're working towards, right? So it might have a particular theme in the title or an idea that you know you want to explore in your narrative. So you're able to kind of keep that in the front of your mind by having an early title. So brainstorming ideas for titles, I think, is a good idea. Now, ultimately, what you're going to do after this lecture is you're going to complete journal assignment number 3, which is essentially just brainstorming 2 titles and then talking about why you feel that they are effective. You know, you're not locked into any title that you come up with. If you decide to come up with 2 titles for the journal assignment on Friday, September 8th, and then ultimately bail on those 2 and come up with a different one altogether, that's perfectly fine. You know, when it comes to brainstorming and pre-writing, the more information you have, the better. So titles are not an insignificant part of an essay. And like I was saying earlier, they tend to be sort of an afterthought. You need to be intentional about a title because it is a great opportunity to sort of make a first impression on your reader. And we all know what we've been told about second chances on making first impressions. You only really get one chance to make a first impression. So like I said, introducing this, the most common format in an academic essay, so like in a research essay, is this 2-part title where you have something abstract and then something precise or specific. You have the first part of the title, a colon, and the second part. Now, again, you don't necessarily have to do that for a personal narrative, but I just wanted to talk about the idea of academic essay titles in general, firstly. The idea of a 2-part academic title is you have something attention-grabbing or something interesting, and then something specific. So some examples might be something like this: Smashing the Monolith, colon, Metaphor and Meaning in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. So notice how the 2 parts sort of work in tandem. You have the first part of the title, which is the interesting part, Smashing the Monolith, which, if you're familiar with Stanley Kubrick's work, has something to do with a symbol in one of his movies that's a monolith. So Smashing the Monolith is like the interesting and attention-grabbing part. But on its own, it doesn't really mean anything. If you just entitled a paper Smashing the Monolith, a reader might be, oh, that's kind of a cool phrase, but they would really have no idea what the essay is about. And that's where the second part of the 2-part title comes in. You need the second part for the first part to make sense. So they work together, right? So this example, the second one right here, are you finding a perfect match or are they finding a perfect victim? The rise of internet dating and cyberstalking. So again, if it was just the first part, are you finding a perfect match or are they finding a perfect victim? You really wouldn't know what that essay is about. You need the second part, the rise of internet dating and cyberstalking, to make sense of the first part. Let's say that you were writing an essay about gang violence in the city of Philadelphia. So an example of a 2-part title on that essay might be something like Teens Dying in the Streets, colon, an analysis of gang violence in Philadelphia. So why does this title work? Well, the 2 parts work together, but imagine if you didn't have the 2 parts. Imagine if your essay was only entitled Teens Dying in the Streets. That's definitely a provocative phrase, but it really wouldn't tell your reader what your essay is about, right? It could be about any teens in any streets dying for any reason, right? The essay might even be about, the higher death rate among teenage drivers due to distracted driving and texting while driving or something like that. You really wouldn't know what the essay is about. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, let's take that second part. Let's say that you just entitled your essay, An Analysis of Gang Violence in Philadelphia. Okay, it's specific. You would understand what the essay is about, but it's not particularly compelling. In other words, it doesn't really get the reader interested because they don't know what's at stake. Why is an analysis of gang violence in Philadelphia important? So when you put the two parts together, they sort of work in tandem. You have the teens dying in the streets, analysis of gang violence in Philadelphia. So that's a traditional two-part academic title. And when we get to the research essay at the end of the semester, I'll really sort of push you to do that. All right, so that was a little bit about creating a title as it relates to a traditional research essay. You're not writing a research essay right now. What all of you are writing are a personal narrative. And personal narrative titles are a little bit different. Personal narratives are inherently creative, and so their titles are likewise inherently creative. Now, you're free to use the two-part academic title like we just looked at for a narrative, and we'll look at some examples of just that, but you also can come up with other things. So when it comes to a personal narrative essay, the best titles are those that give a little of the essay content away, but they sort of require the reader to jump into the text and read it in order to fully understand what the title means. And this is why I always say that a title is much like the opening sentence or the opening paragraph or the opening section of an essay, because its goal is similar. It's not just to inform, although it is. It's likewise meant to sort of grab your reader's attention and compel them to read on. So good titles convince readers that they want to keep reading. First of all, what you don't want to do. You don't want to entitle your personal narrative or Major Assignment 1, right? You need to come up with a title that is reflective of the content, theme, idea, plot, outcome, moral, whatever of your story, right? So you want to connect it to the topic of your personal narrative. So your title gives the reader a clear idea of the topic of your narrative, but you don't want to bait and switch either. And what that means is you state one thing and then the essay ends up being something completely different. That's called a bait and switch. You don't want to do that. If your title makes readers think your narrative is about one thing and then it turns out to be something entirely different, your reader's going to feel like they were cheated. So you want to make sure your title ends up really being about the content. And this is why often you end up changing a title after writing the essay, because maybe you ended up taking the essay in some sort of new direction. That's a good thing, right? And if you think it's better for the final product, then that's fantastic. And in which case, if the title doesn't match, the title you came up with earlier doesn't match the end product, it's much easier to change one small title to match an entire essay than it is to change an entire essay to match a title, right? So titles can always be changed. It's much harder to change a 3-page or 4-page or 5-page story. Likewise, you don't want to give everything away in your title. So it's just enough to get your reader interested. So titles are not straightforward, right? They sort of will set a tone often or give a sense of what the essay might be about. But having said that, you don't want the title to be something just simple like sadness. It's a little too simplistic. And likewise, if your essay and title was like eternal sadness, maybe it's closer to what your essay is about, but it's a little too melodramatic. So when it comes to a personal narrative title, you can use that two-part title, which is officially called a compound title, by the way. I call it a two-part title, but you may hear other professors refer to it as a compound title. If you were going to do a compound title with a personal narrative, the first word would be the part that sort of grabs the tone, perhaps, of the essay or the general theme, right? Something like redemption, how I survived summer camp. So notice how the two parts work in tandem. You have the first part, redemption, which sort of broad, and if your title was just redemption and you stopped there, the reader might get a sense of what the essay is about. You're going to be redeemed at some point or try to be redeemed, or maybe someone else is going to be redeemed. But that's the whole point, is there's too much unsaid. It's too loose, it's too nebulous and vague. But the second part helps the first part make sense. So when you add the how I survived summer camp, now your reader's like, oh, I know what you're referring to, redeeming from summer camp. Okay, I get it now. Here are some examples of personal narrative essay titles. The best and worst summer ever. The day I left my childhood behind. The funny yet horrifying tale of the two tall boots. How sorrow feels, my first great heartbreak. Finding love, losing hate. Change can be a good thing, except when it's not. Learning about death, surviving the loss of my everything. Grandma's telling the story about the banana bread again. When I knew, a story of living authentically. So these are some examples of titles that students have done in the past. And you notice that there are, in the instance, some students have chosen to use that compound title, like this one right here, How Sorrow Feels, my first great heartbreak. That's a great narrative title because it really does sort of convey the main idea of the essay. We don't know what the heartbreak is, but we kind of get an idea of the theme of the essay. Others are a little bit more witty and satirical, right? So the funny yet horrifying tale of the two tall boots. That's sort of a funny title. One of the things you want to do is you want your title to match the tone of your essay. If your title is sorrowful, or then you kind of want the essay to feel that way as well. You don't want to bait and switch where you have an essay title that seems really morose, and then the essay itself or the story itself is really happy and joyful, because the reader is going to be like, wait, why was that title so depressing? And then the story is like really happy. They don't match. So you want your title to sort of match the feeling, the vibe beyond your story. Is it a happy story? Come up with a happy title. Is it a sad story? Come up with a sad title. All right, so what are you doing with this newfound knowledge that I just presented? Well, like I mentioned, for Friday, September 8th, the idea twofold. One, you watch this video that you're all doing right now. Second part is to complete a particular assignment. In this case, it's going to be journal assignment number 3. Now, I've created it, but it's not yet accessible. But by the time you see this video, it will absolutely be available to you. But here's the actual assignment instructions. It says a narrative title is best when it accomplishes 2 things. It's interesting and informative. Your title should go beyond something overly simple like my story, but not go so far in the other direction that you end up with a prosaic title. Prosaic is a fancy word for like a sentence. Like in prose, when you write out in prose, means you write out in full sentences and full paragraphs. So you don't want your title to be like a full sentence, like the day I got my driver's license and took my friends to the mall and the car broke down. Although that might be informative in terms of what happened in that story, it's a little bit not just long, it's really just a sentence that could better be served in the body of your essay somewhere rather than your title. So our narrative title hints at the story's content and perhaps its theme: friendship, joy, love, grief, freedom, whatever that may be. One possible approach, like we said, is to use the compound or the 2-part title. You don't have to do that. But if you feel comfortable, if you've done that before, then by all means, feel free to embrace it for the personal narrative. But if you have a different idea for your title, that's fine. Remember, personal narratives are at their core a creative writing piece. So the title is going to be creative as well. So as we see here, here are some additional examples over and above the ones that we looked at in the PowerPoint. Playing in the Mud, How I Fell in Love with Riding Dirt Bikes. Stitches, Scars, and Appendectomies. A Stranger in an Even Stranger Land, a tale of the awkward, anxious, skinny, clumsy new kid. Accept It, I'm Trans, Dad. When My Walls Were Whispering Family Secrets. Is This the End? The Day I Left My Disabilities, Diagnoses, and Medications Behind. E2 Brute, How My Best Friend Sold Me Down the River for liking the same boy. Lost and Found, My Hilarious Misadventures in New York City. The Day the Stars Wept, Coping with the Loss of My Best Friend. And When the Prank Goes Wrong. Just another half dozen or so examples of personal narrative titles. So between the ones that are in the PowerPoint, between the ones that are here in the assignment instructions, you should be in good shape. Now, what are you actually doing for this assignment? You're doing 2 things. You're brainstorming 2 titles, but I'm not going to let you get off the hook at just writing 2 titles. I want you to actually analyze your own title, reflect on your own title, and offer some insight into why you think your title is a good title, right? So firstly, brainstorm 2 possible titles for your personal narrative. Secondly, compose 1 or 2 sentences, doesn't have to be long, but offer some explanation as to why you chose the title. Why do you think it's a good title? What is it about the title that you've just come up with that you think is valuable? Finally, last thing, and then we'll wrap things up right here. This is a great resource if you don't know how to capitalize a title appropriately. So for example, if we look at this first title right here, you'll notice like the P in playing is capitalized, but the I in is not, or the T in the is not. And the same with all the other titles. When you write a title, some words are capitalized, some aren't. But that's really easier said than done. Well, you don't have to worry about that because this resource, Capitalize My Title, is fantastic. You just type your title right here and it will create for you the proper capitalization of your title. So the link is there in the assignment instructions, but you can easily remember it as just capitalizemytitle.com. Last thing, you're not locked into any of these titles. If you ultimately decide to go in a different direction, with the final draft of your personal narrative. To me, that's a good thing, right? So that shows the student is continuing to think, continuing to analyze, continuing to make more editorial decisions, up until the graded version. That's a good thing to me. So don't feel like you're locked into any of these titles. All right, so that's the lecture for Friday, September 8th. Remember, be sure to complete journal number 3 before the end of the day on Friday, September 8th, in order to get attendance credit for the class. Most importantly, if you have questions, as always, reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you all next week.